Selection is the process of choosing from a group of applicants the individual best suited for a particular position and the organization. Probably matching people with jobs and the organization is the goal of the selection process. If individuals are overqualified, underqualified, or for any reason do not fit either the job or the organization's culture, they will be inefficient and probably leave the firm voluntarily or otherwise. The recruitment and selection process start usually with a vacancy or there is an open position to fill. So based on this situation, you define and evaluate the position. This means that you write a job description and job specification based on a job analysis. After this step, you start the administration process, which we had already in the last session, which is called the employee requisition. Then, based on the analysis of the labor market, the communication about the vacancy start. So you can decide either internal or external recruitment. And based on this, you choose the selection process. And then you hire the person and you start the onboarding or orientation process. The traditional selection process describes a combined use of three methods of selection: application forms, interview, and references. The key elements of this process are the application form and the interviews. References play an important but subsidiary role, operating as either an information and evaluation source for shortlisting and interview questions, or as a check of interview decision. Regardless of whether a position is filled internally or externally, it is essential that the information gathered about the candidates are reliable, valid, and gathered legally, and the privacy of the applicant safeguarded. The degree to which interviews, tests, and other selection procedure yield consistent information over a period of time is known as reliability. What does it mean? An example is that interviewers who judge the capabilities of a particular group of applicants today is the same like they did yesterday. Otherwise, they will be unreliable. Validity. Validity, in other words, means that the selection process should be able to predict how well a person performs on the job. Like a new machine, a selection process must be validated before it is used. I'm pretty sure that you know already a lot about these different elements, about the motivational letter, about the CV, resume. Sometimes the difference between CV and resume is country specific. In some countries they use it in this way or in another way. For me, a CV is much longer, a resume is a conclusion. But nevertheless, both of them should be tailored to the specific position you are applying. Education and employment certificates, references, we talked about. Working sample. Working samples are asked to send to the organization because they show what the applicant did in the past or is able to do. Application forms provide a fairly quick and systematic means of obtaining a variety of information about the applicant, such as whether the applicant met the minimum requirements for experiences, education, and so on. For example, McDonald's uses a form that is quite brief but asks for information that is highly relevant to the job performance. Other methods which are used for the initial screening are, like we said, the cover letters and the resume, which you send to the organization via email, e-recruiting or however. Then it's internet checks and phone screening. So this means that the company checks your Facebook account, for example. So therefore you have to be very careful what you publish in the net, because remember, the internet has a big memory. And nowadays it's also video resumes, which we send. These are short video clips that highlight the applicant's capability or qualifications beyond what they can communicate in their resume. Having obtained the application forms and screened it, the next step is to shortlist the candidates. Shortlist means that it fluctuates from highly informal to systematic on ground of fairness. Most commentators maintain that the systematic approach is the better option. Very often, before you invite people to a face-to-face interview, you are doing a telephone interview. But the interviews are done in a similar way. So it has 3 different phases: the opening phases, interview phase, and the closing phase. And it is very much important that you do it that you prepared it, that you really have a guideline. What are based on the requirements, that you have a table, for example, where you can write the answers and where you have enough time to take notes. It is recommended that HR does it together with a specialist who can ask more technical questions. And it is good to send an email before the interview takes place, that the interviewee has enough time to prepare. Traditionally, the employment interview has played a central role in the selection process. Also, researchers have raised some doubts about its validity. The interview continues to be used because it is especially practical when there are only a small number of applicants. It serves other purposes such as public relations, and interviewers maintain great faith and confidence in their judgments. Nevertheless, the interview can be plagued by problems of subjectivity and personal bias. This figure shows you a number of applicants' characteristic and situational factors which can affect the perception of the interviewer. For example, the race and the sex of an applicant can shape the expectations, biases, and behavior of the interviewer, which can affect the interview's outcome. Even a limited understanding of the variables shown in the figure and a periodic training have been shown to dramatically improve the effectiveness of the interviews. The preparation of the interview is one of the most important points, because you have to be sure what kind of job you are doing for which you are doing the interview, as the same is what are the relevant competencies, and that you also have a look to the application forms and the references the person has sent in, that you can ask appropriate questions. We heard before that training has shown to be dramatically improve the competence of the interviewer. And one aspect, which is the most crucial one, is to understand the job. This means that the research has shown that interviewers who understand the parameters of a job are better at interviewing people and evaluating their responses. It's important to examine the purpose of the interview and determine the area and the specific questions to be covered. Review the job requirements, application form, data, test scores, and other available information before seeing the applicant. Establish and maintain rapport and listen actively. This is accomplished by greeting the applicant pleasantly. Explain the purpose of the interview, displaying sincere interest in what the person has to say, and listening carefully. Try to understand what the candidate is not only saying, but implying. An applicant's facial expression, the gesture, the body position and movement often provide clues to the person's attitude and feelings. Answer fully and frankly the applicant's question. Present a realistic picture of the job. Ask open-end questions rather than questions that can be answered by a simple yes or no. Do not ask questions that lead candidates to the right answers. Phrase the question in a neutral way. During the interview, record factual information. Later, record your inferences or interpretations of the fact. Compare your inferences with those of other interviewers. Then other two aspects I don't describe now because we are going to discuss them later on when we talk about interview biases. But the last point is control the course of the interview. This means is establish an interview plan and stick to it. And standardized the question asked means to increase the reliability of the interview and avoid discrimination. Ask the same question of all applicants for a particular job. Keep careful notes, record facts, impression, and any relevant information. Include what was told to the applicant. We can differentiate between unstructured interviews, structured interviews, and semi-structured focused interviews. If we talk about unstructured interviews, you ask probing open-end questions. This type of interview is comprehensive, and the interviewer encourages the applicant to do much of the talking. Questions such as what professional accomplishments are you most proud of and why? What is your greatest professional strength and how have you used it over a challenge in your career might be asked. The unstructured interview is often more time-consuming than the structured interview and results in obtaining different information from different candidates. The structured interview is where the interviewer asks each applicant for a particular job the same series of job-related questions. Although interviews have historically been very poor predictors of job success, use of structured interviews increases reliability and accuracy by reducing the subjectivity and inconsistency of unstructured interviews. Here on this slide you have several examples about behavioral interviews or behavioral questions, which try to find out, based on what you did in the past, it will be a prediction for the future. Whereas the behavioral interview focuses on how an individual handled circumstances in the past, the situational interview creates hypothetical situations candidates would likely encounter on the jobs and asks how they would handle them. For example, the question might be asked: once of your employees has experienced a significant decline in productivity, how would you handle it? Research on interview as a method of selection indicates that panel interviews are the best approach in terms of the validity of decisions made, but least popular with candidates. In a typical employment interview, the applicant meets one-on-one with an interviewer. Meeting alone with the interviewer is often less threatening and provides a better opportunity for an effective exchange of information. In a group interview, several applicants interact in the presence of one or more interviewers. This approach may provide useful insights into the candidate's interpersonal competence as they engage in a group discussion. The board interview or panel interview is where several of the firm's representatives interview a candidate at the same time. Sometimes applicants are interviewed by peers, subordinates, or potential supervisors. This is called a multiple interview. This approach permits the firm to get a more encompassing view of the candidate. It also gives the candidate a chance to learn more about the company from a variety of perspectives. In an independent study of 500 HR managers at US companies, 6 in 10 of them said their firms often conduct video interviews via webcams and services such as Skype. Video interviews are attractive because of their convenience and low cost, and because they makes it easier to interview people in different geographical areas, thereby expanding the talent pool. Many companies use computer-assisted or automated interviews to gather information as well as compare candidates. In a computer-assisted automatic interview, the questions are administered to applicants via a computer. The interviews can be conducted at a firm's facility using kiosks, online, or via phone. Some firms use video interviewing services. Applicants are involved to interview by email, giving passwords to log on the website and give questions to answer, which are then recorded and sent to the hiring firm. What would you do if you were in an interview that was going quite well, and at At once, the interviewer said, "I think your answer is totally inadequate. It doesn't deal with my concerns at all. Can't you do better than that?" You may not realize it, but you have just been exposed to a stress interview. In the stress interview, the interviewers intentionally creates anxiety. Realistic job previews convey both positive and negative job information to the applicant in an unbiased manner. Many applicants have unrealistic expectations about their prospective job they are seeking. They may have been told to the exciting part of the job, but the less glamorous area are not mentioned. Realistic job reviews have been increasingly common in certain fields because of the high turnover rates and the constant cost of replacing those individuals who do not work out. On the next slides, you see the different phases of the interview. So usually it is divided in three parts. The planning, of course, what we mentioned before, the beginning where you start with making the person easy, asking how they find the way to come to the company, how they are doing at the moment. Then central part where you ask the main questions, and then the end where you ask the candidate if they have questions, and the documentation. And when they get to know the result. At this slide, you can see the proportion of communication in the interview. Usually it is said that 80% should be said by the candidate, but this is very often only in theory. Well, you start with the welcome, like we said before, then you ask for the personal background, the professional background, and the motivation. Then you inform the candidate about the company. You start with the contract negotiations later on and the ending. Open question draw the candidate out. Most of the time they begin with what, why, when, and who. Tell me about la la la. Close question usually to clarify a point of fact, and which is often only required a short or single word of answer. Hypothetical question we talked already about. Probing questions means which are necessary if you feel a candidate has not given you a full answer and you want to find out more. They can be used immediately after a candidate has referred to something you would like to know more about it. Reflecting questions are designed to encourage the candidate to reflect on the experience and consider how he or she might have dealt with the situation in a different way. Reflective question can be used to reflect back what you think a speaker has said to check understanding. You can also reflect the speaker's feeling, which is usually in dealing with angry or difficult persons and for diffusing emotional situations. Multiple question example is tell me how you got your present job, what attracted you to do it, and which parts of it you liked best and which parts you liked less. Do you prefer it to do the job you had before that? This leaves the candidate confused as to which part of the question should be answered first, and both the candidate and the interviewers are likely to forget all the parts of the original question. Employers should provide their interviewers with instruction on how to avoid potentially discriminatory questions in their interviews. Example for appropriate and inappropriate question can serve as a guideline for application forms as well as pre-employment interviews. For example, if you talk about the age, you can ask, are you over 18? If you hire, you can prove your age, and it's inappropriate to ask how old you are, what is your date of birth, or depending on the race, the inappropriate question would be, what is your race? And this is very much depending also on the country and the circumstances. For example, the marital or the family status, it is appropriate to ask what is the name, address, and telephone number of a person we may contact in case of an emergency. But an inappropriate question would be, are you married, divorced, single? Do you prefer Miss, or Miss? Do you have any children, and how old are they? When the interviewer is satisfied that the applicant is potentially qualified, information about previous employment as well as other information provided by the applicant is investigated. So you can do reference checks, this we talked about already, or you can do background checks. Background investigation, which requires the consent of the applicant, have become standard procedure for many organizations. Moreover, state courts in the US have ruled that companies can be held liable for neglecting hiring if they fail to do adequate background check. Federal law requires comprehensive background checks for all child care providers, for example. According to the Society of Human Resource Management, most major firms check candidates' background for criminal records. Credit checks are conducted primarily to screen applicants who handle money, such as banking employees. This slide shows you that you first identify the required profile for the job. This is what we said with the job specification. Then you analyze the capability profile of the candidate, what he is capable to do. And then at the end, you compare these two things and you identify a suitability profile, which then indicates you clearly what is available, but not necessary, and what is essential or necessary, but not available. We talked already from the beginning that the interviewer should avoid interview biases. So interview biases is, for example, the stereotype bias. So this means that when interviewer assumes that the applicant has certain traits because they are member of a certain class. The classic case of stereotyping bias is when an interviewer assumes that a woman applicant cannot meet a certain physical requirement, such as being able to lift 50 pounds. The positive halo bias occurs when the interviewer generalizes one positive first impression. An example could be that you discover that you have something in common with the applicant. The contrast bias is when an interviewer meets with several poorly qualified applicants and then confronts a mediocre candidate. By comparison, the last applicant may appear to be better qualified than he or she actually is. The opposite can also occur. Suppose that a clearly outstanding candidate is followed by a very poor candidate. The second candidate may not be considered even if the first candidate turns down the job offer. The premature judgment bias suggests that the interviewers often make judgments about the candidates in the first minutes of the interview. And the interview illusion bias is closely related to this premature judgment, but not the same. Managers say something to the effect, give me just 5 minutes with an applicant and I can tell you if they will be successful with our company. Their belief in their interview ability was likely exaggerated. Recruiters are often overconvinced about their ability to judge others in general. Interviewers have to be careful about placing excessive weight on interviews and think, I just feel good about this applicant when making the hire decision.